Welcome to this deep dive from irisharchaeology.org. We're focusing today on a truly pivotal era in Ireland's past, the Neolithic period, roughly 4000 to 2500 BC.
A huge turning point. Absolutely.
It really was. I mean, this wasn't just a slow evolution, was it? It feels more like a revolution. The arrival of settled farming, completely new technologies, and these, well, incredible monuments appearing on the landscape.
Exactly. A fundamental shift away from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle of the Mesolithic.
So today, our main issue, is to explore the evidence we have for these really organized farming landscapes in Neolithic Ireland. We'll be looking closely at the Céide Fields, which are just extraordinary.
They really are a key site.
And through that, try to get a handle on the broader changes this agricultural revolution actually brought about.
Well, to really grasp the Neolithic significance, you have to contrast it with what came before, the Mesolithic. That period lasted, 4,000 years or so after the ice retreated?
A long time.
A very long time. And those communities were incredibly skilled hunter-gatherer fishers. They knew their environment intimately, coasts, rivers. That's where they thrived.
And they had their own distinct tools, right? The microliths?
Yes, a sophisticated microlithic technology, tiny, precise stone tools. They were masters of adaptation, living within the natural world, a very successful strategy for millennia.
Until around 4000 BC. Then things started to change quite dramatically with this Neolithic package arriving. Where did that come from? It wasn't the local development.
No, the evidence, both archaeological and, importantly, ancient DNA, points very strongly towards new populations arriving, people coming from Britain and ultimately continental Europe.
So migration played a key role.
A major role. These newcomers had ancestry tracing back to the Near East, the cradle of agriculture, and the DNA studies show a pretty significant demographic shift, actually. Not much genetic continuity from the Irish Mesolithic population.
So it really looks like farming arrived with new people, bringing their established practices.
That seems to be the clearest picture, yes.
Okay, so this Neolithic package, it sounds like more than just farming itself. What exactly was included? What defined this new era?
It was a whole suite of things, really integrated. Crucially, domesticated animals, completely new to Ireland. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs. None of those were here before.
Big change.
Huge. Then you have cultivated cereals, mainly wheat and barley. That's the start of actual crop growing. And new technologies came along too. Pottery, for instance.
For storage and cooking.
Exactly. And polished stone tools, especially those polished stone axes, which were far, far better for clearing woodland than anything the Mesolithic people had.
Makes sense if you're going to start farming.
Absolutely. Plus, we see the first evidence of more permanent timber houses indicating settled communities. And of course, the first megalithic monuments start appearing. Those iconic tombs.
So it wasn't just adding new food sources or tools. It fundamentally changed how people lived, their entire society.
It really did. It was a socio-cultural transformation. You get different worldviews. You see that in the burial practices, the monuments. Social structures probably had to adapt to settled life, managing land, maybe even ideas of ownership.
And their relationship with the environment must have shifted dramatically.
Completely, from adapting to the environment to actively shaping it on a large scale. Clearing forests for fields, for pasture. The whole rhythm of life changes with the agricultural cycle, demanding settlement, cooperation, planning.
Which leads to those more permanent houses and the monuments as focal points.
Precisely.
Now, Ireland, being an island,
Yeah.
did that affect how the Neolithic took hold here compared to, say, mainland Europe?
That's a really interesting point. Ireland's relative isolation during the Mesolithic meant it had developed its own unique cultural path. So when this comprehensive Neolithic package arrived, largely with new people, the transition seems quite well pronounced. Perhaps more abrupt than in some parts of Europe where farming spread more gradually among existing populations.
So the insularity might explain why we see this seemingly rapid adoption of the whole package and the limited genetic continuity.
It's certainly a strong possibility. It might have amplified the impact, leading to that swift and profound transformation of the landscape and society we see evidence for.
Okay, so with these foundations laid, what are the defining characteristics of Neolithic Ireland as it developed? The landscape, the society?
Well, a clear shift to settled communities. We see that in the archaeology, those early rectangular timber houses are a key indicator. Agriculture becomes central, obviously. Emmer, wheat, and barley are the staples, and those new animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, become vital.
And the monuments, We have to talk about the megalithic tombs. They're just so iconic. What was their role?
They really are. The court tombs, portal tombs, and later the incredible passage tombs like Newgrange. They define the era. They represent amazing engineering feats requiring huge communal effort.
Not built by individuals.
Definitely not. And they tell us about complex beliefs probably focused on ancestors, maybe the cosmos too, given the astronomical alignments we see in some passage tombs.
Beyond the massive tombs, what about everyday objects? What does their material culture tell us?
Well, pottery is a big one. We see distinct styles emerging, like carinated bowls early on, then Lyle's Hill ware. That tells us about food processing, storage, maybe even social customs around eating and drinking.
And the axes. You mentioned them being important.
Crucial. Those polished axes, often made from specific rock sources like flint or the porcelainite from Antrim, show us how vital woodland clearance was, and the fact that porcelainite axes traveled hundreds of kilometers from the source.
Ah, that implies trade networks.
Exactly. It hints at connections, exchange, interaction between different communities across the island.
It really feels like farming and monument building were somehow linked. Did one enable the other?
They seem deeply intertwined, yes. A more stable food supply from agriculture, maybe even surpluses, could free up the time and labor needed for monument building. And the monuments themselves likely served functions vital to a farming society.
Like what?
Well, maybe territorial markers. In a landscape, being divided up for fields, claiming ancestral ties to the land could be important. They were certainly ritual centers, bringing communities together, reinforcing social bonds needed for farming.
And you mentioned alignments, maybe linked to the farming calendar.
That's a strong possibility, especially with passage tombs. Alignments to solstices or equinoxes could have helped mark key times for planting or harvesting. They were part of the system.
Now, the Neolithic wasn't just one static period, was it? It lasted about 1,500 years. Did things change much over that time?
Oh, absolutely. Archaeologists divide it into phases, early, middle, late Neolithic, precisely because things did evolve. Farming techniques likely improved, settlement patterns might have shifted.
Oh, so.
Well, those substantial timber houses seem more common early on. Later, maybe there's a move towards greater mobility, perhaps linked to more emphasis on pastoralism, and dwellings become less archaeologically visible, maybe less substantial. Tomb types also change, pottery styles evolve. It was a dynamic period, not static at all.
Which brings us neatly to the Céide Fields in County Mayo. This site sounds like an exceptional snapshot of a Neolithic farming landscape. What's so special about it?
It's globally significant, truly. What's special is the preservation. An entire landscape field, walls, houses, tombs was sealed beneath blanket bog for thousands of years.
Wow. So we can see the layout.
We can see the layout, the scale, the organization, in a way that's almost impossible anywhere else from this period. It's an unparalleled window into how these early farmers structured their world.
How was it even found under all that peat?
It was actually a local school teacher, Patrick Caulfield, back in the 1930s. He noticed these regular patterns of stone walls while cutting turf. He realized they had to be ancient, buried so deep.
Amazing insight.
It was. But it was his son, Dr. Seamus Caulfield, an archaeologist, who really began systematic investigation in the 1970s. Probing, excavation, revealing the sheer extent of it all.
And the peat itself is key to that preservation, like a natural time capsule.
Absolutely. The blanket bog grew over it, creating waterlogged, oxygen-poor, acidic conditions that essentially halted decay and protected the stone structures from later farming, erosion, everything.
And the bog formation itself might be linked to climate or even early farming.
That's part of the story, yes. A shift to a wetter climate likely played a role, but forest clearance by those early farmers could well have contributed to changing drainage, destabilizing soils, making conditions ripe for bog growth.
The scale you mentioned.
Yeah.
How big are we talking?
Initially, people thought maybe 12 square kilometers, which is already huge, but further work suggests it could be much larger, maybe over 1,000 hectares. That's thousands of acres.
Holiness.
And they've mapped over 100 kilometers of stone walls within that. It makes Céide the most extensive Neolithic site known in Ireland, and genuinely one of the oldest and largest organized field systems known anywhere in the world from this time.
Incredible. But there's been some debate about the dating, hasn't there? Was it definitely Neolithic?
Yes, that's important. For a long time, the consensus, based on early radiocarbon dates and finds, placed it firmly in the early to middle Neolithic, say around 3,500 BC, maybe starting even earlier, 3,800 BC.
Which made it a prime example of really early organized farming.
Exactly. But then, in 2017, Andrew Whitefield challenged that. He reanalyzed the radiocarbon dates, looked critically at the methodology and environmental data, and proposed a later date, potentially Bronze Age.
A significant challenge. What was the basis for that?
His arguments focused on the statistical treatment of the dates, questioning the direct association of some dated material with the walls, and interpretations of the pollen evidence used to signal early farming.
So a debate based on interpreting the evidence. How was that resolved, or is it still ongoing?
Well, it spurred further research. Professor Michael O'Connell and his team undertook very detailed multidisciplinary work, published in 2020, new pollen analysis, studies of preserved pine trees from the bog, crucial new radiocarbon dates directly associated with wall construction.
And the outcome?
Their findings strongly reaffirmed the early Neolithic dating. They pinpointed intensive farming between about 3800 and 3400 BC, with the main wall building happening in the earlier part of that window. So the evidence now points very robustly back to an early Neolithic origin.
That whole process really shows how archaeology works, doesn't it? Questioning, reevaluating new evidence.
It absolutely does. It's the scientific process in action.
Okay, so Céide is firmly Neolithic. Let's picture this landscape. What did the fields and settlements look like?
The walls are the most obvious feature. Dry stone walls, carefully built, forming these large, surprisingly regular rectangular fields, maybe 4 to 10 acres each.
Rectangular. That implies planning.
Definitely. Some walls run for over 1.5 kilometers, often parallel, sometimes following the contours of the land. It's highly organized. They found evidence of houses too, an oval enclosure with post holes and a hearth. Suggestions of roundhouses, maybe 6 meters across, sometimes within their own smaller enclosures.
And tombs were part of this, integrated right into the fields.
Yes, like the Behi court tomb. It sits right there within the system. It shows these weren't just functional farming landscapes. Ritual and burial were woven into the fabric of daily life and land use.
The regularity and scale. What does that tell us about the people, their skills, their society?
It implies sophisticated thinking about space, land division, resource management. They must have had methods for laying things out, measuring somehow. It suggests a structured approach, maybe allocating land for different uses or different groups.
A huge communal effort, too.
Immense. And long-term planning, a deep connection to, an investment in that specific place.
What about the farming itself at Céide? What were they actually doing in those fields?
The evidence points towards a mixed farming system, but with a really strong emphasis on cattle. Pastoralism seems key here.
So those big rectangular fields were mostly for grazing.
That's the main interpretation, yes. Managing herds, perhaps separating different types of cattle, maybe even dairying, although direct evidence for dairying is tricky. But there was crop growing, too. In smaller plots, often closer to the settlement areas. They found evidence for emmer wheat cultivation there. And finds back this up, a primitive stone plow tip, an ardshare.
Like a scratch plow.
Exactly. And saddle querns for grinding the grain, Neolithic pottery, plus soil analysis has found actual ard marks under the peat and even biochemical traces of cattle dung in some fields.
Concrete evidence.
Yeah.
Why such a focus on cattle, do you think? Was it the local environment?
That could be part of it. North Mayo might have been better suited to grazing than intensive grain cultivation, perhaps wetter, poorer soils, but it could also be socioeconomic.
How so?
Maybe they specialized in livestock, trading cattle or dairy products for things they needed, like those porcelainite axes from Antrim that turn up at Céide. They weren't making those locally. Cattle might also have had significant social or cultural value beyond just food.
The effort involved in building and maintaining Céide. It implies a pretty organized community, doesn't it? What can we infer about their social structure?
It must have been a community with strong social cohesion, shared rules or norms, and ways to organize large groups of people for work. We're talking maybe hundreds of people needed for the initial wall building.
So a substantial population.
Likely a sizable, settled community, perhaps 50 or 60 families, maybe around 300 people, farmers, builders, craftspeople. And they weren't isolated, finding non-local flint, and those Antrim axes shows they were part of wider networks.
And the tombs reinforce that community idea.
Yes, the integrated tombs point to shared beliefs, rituals, connection to ancestors and the land, all binding the community together. The ability to plan and execute something on this scale suggests, well, emergent social complexity, maybe some form of leadership or at least very effective cooperative structures and agreements about land.
Céide is amazing because it's so well preserved. But was this kind of organized landscape unique, or were there others like it across Neolithic Ireland?
Well, Céide is certainly the best preserved example we have by far. But the farming transformation itself was happening all over Ireland. Finding other Neolithic field systems is just much harder because later farming and erosion have wiped away most of the evidence.
But there are hints elsewhere.
There are hints. Sometimes you see the alignment of later field walls, perhaps fossilizing much older boundaries. Archaeological surveys, especially in Mayo near Céide, places like Belderrig, Garrynogran, have found more evidence, also potentially along the west coast, the Burren, Connemara. The challenge is often dating them securely and distinguishing them from later Bronze Age or Iron Age Celtic fields.
Okay. And what about settlements generally in Neolithic Ireland? Beyond Céide, you mentioned those early timber houses.
Yes, that house horizon in the early Neolithic, with substantial rectangular timber buildings like those excavated at Ballinagally or Ballyglass, points to a definite shift towards more permanent settlements early on.
But maybe not always villages. Could they be dispersed farmsteads?
It's varied. We find those big houses, but also lots of sites with just pits, hearths, scatters of flint suggesting other kinds of activity areas, maybe less substantial dwellings that don't leave such clear traces. And as I mentioned, there's a theory that later in the Neolithic, perhaps after 3600 BC, settlement might have become more mobile again, maybe less focused on big permanent houses, possibly linked to that increasing emphasis on pastoralism.
Let's nail down the specifics of farming across the island then. What were the main crops and animals, generally speaking?
Emmer wheat seems to have been the primary cereal crop across the board. Barley, both the hulled and naked varieties, was important too. And flax grown for fiber, for linen, and also for its oil-rich seeds.
Oats and rye.
Probably just weeds at this stage. They become important later. For animals, it's that founder package brought by the newcomers. Cattle, definitely prominent. We see early evidence for them. Then sheep and goats, hard to tell apart from their bones sometimes, and pigs.
All introduced.
All introduced. Even red deer seem to have been brought over around this time, which is interesting. It really underlines that this was an imported system adapted to Irish conditions.
And the tools they needed for this. We've mentioned axes, ards, querns.
Yes, the polished stone axes, especially those widely traded porcelainite ones, were essential for clearing the forests. The ard, that simple plough for breaking the soil. Saddle querns for grinding grain, a laborious task. Pottery for storage and cooking. And they still used flint for arrowheads, knives, scrapers, other tools. It's the combination of these technologies that makes the whole system work.
Did they understand about maintaining soil fertility? Or was it slash and burn, move on?
There's growing evidence they did manage the soil. We're finding biochemical signatures in ancient soils that suggest manuring using animal dung, maybe household waste, even seaweed in coastal areas.
Really? That early?
It seems so. The idea of fixed plots being cultivated over time rather than constant shifting also points towards efforts to maintain fertility. As for storing the harvest, we don't have much evidence for purpose-built granaries like you see later. Storage was likely in pits, maybe lined, or in large ceramic pots. The finds of charred grain are often remnants of stored crops, perhaps accidentally burnt.
This shift to farming, the need for fields. It must have meant massive changes to the environment. Ireland was heavily forested after the Ice Age, wasn't it?
It was. The Neolithic marks the first really large-scale woodland clearance by humans in Ireland, and it had huge, lasting ecological impact.
How did they even do it? With stone axes?
Stone axes, yes. Hard work, felling trees one by one. But fire was almost certainly used too to clear undergrowth, maybe even to help bring down bigger trees or clear large areas more quickly. Girdling, or ring barking, was another technique. Kill the tree by cutting the bark, then it's easier to fell or burn later.
A combination of methods.
Probably. There's talk of the lardroom system, ring barking, letting trees die, then burning. That could clear land and provide an initial boost of fertility from the ash, but maybe wasn't sustainable long-term in one spot.
How do we know this deforestation happened? What's the evidence?
Paleoenvironmental studies are key here, especially pollen analysis from lake sediments or peat bogs. Scientists core down through the layers, and the pollen grains preserved at different levels tell a story.
What story do they tell for the Neolithic?
A clear decline in tree pollen elm, oak, pine, hazel, and a corresponding increase in pollen from grasses and herbs, especially things like plantain, which thrives in open pasture land.
The elm decline is famous, isn't it? Around 4000 BC.
Yes, that sharp drop in elm pollen across much of Northwest Europe, including Ireland, happens right around the time we see the first definite signs of farming. The link seems undeniable: human activity impacting the woodlands on a massive scale. These pollen diagrams give us a regional picture that backs up the archaeological site evidence.
Does the pollen show continuous decline or phases?
It often shows phases. Periods of clearance followed by some woodland regeneration, then more clearance. It suggests a dynamic process, perhaps cycles of land use, abandonment, and reuse.
What were the environmental knock-on effects of clearing so much forest?
One major one, especially in wetter upland areas, was kickstarting or accelerating the growth of blanket bog. Removing trees changes the hydrology, exposes soil, leads to waterlogging and acidification. Perfect conditions for bog mosses to take over. You find ancient tree stumps preserved deep in bogs, evidence of the forests that were lost.
So ironically, the farming that needed cleared land helped create the bogs that later preserve sites like Caja.
Exactly. It also changed soils, potentially leading to nutrient loss and erosion in some places. And of course, loss of habitat meant loss of biodiversity. This is the beginning of the long process of reducing Ireland's native woodland cover, potentially impacting species, maybe even contributing to local extinctions like the Scots pine in some areas. It really marks the start of a human-dominated landscape.
Finally, let's circle back to those megalithic monuments. We said they were linked to farming. Can we elaborate on that socio-cultural connection?
Definitely. The timing is striking. Monument building really takes off alongside agriculture. As we discussed, farming likely provided the more stable resource base, and the larger, settled communities needed to mobilize the labor for these huge construction projects.
And the monument served a purpose for the farmers.
They must have. We talked about them potentially being territorial markers in this new farmed landscape, signifying perhaps ancestral ownership or community rights. They were clearly centers for ritual, for honoring the dead, for communal gatherings, all things that would strengthen the social bonds needed for cooperative farming life.
The burials themselves, are they telling us more now?
Yes, recent genetic studies on human remains from some Neolithic tombs are starting to reveal fascinating details about kinship and social structure, suggesting who's being buried together and why it wasn't always close family, sometimes more about social or ritual connection.
And the astronomical alignments again, linking to the sky, the seasons.
It reinforces that connection to cycles, potentially the agricultural cycle. Sites like Newgrange aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. It's hard not to see a link to marking the turning of the year, crucial for any farming society. The different tomb types emerging over time, court, portal, passage, probably also reflect changes in society, beliefs, maybe the scale of communities involved.
So they weren't just tombs, they were active parts of the Neolithic agricultural world.
Absolutely integral. They reflected the new realities of farming life, the connection to land, ancestors, community, cosmos, and they helped sustain that new social and economic order.
This has been fascinating. A real journey through Neolithic Ireland, seeing how the arrival of farming utterly transformed the island. From the specific incredible landscape of the Céide Fields to the wider evidence for new ways of life, new tools, the massive impact on the environment, and that deep, inseparable connection with monument building.
It truly was a profound transformation. It laid the groundwork for everything that followed.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How that first major reshaping of the Irish landscape by its human inhabitants, those first farmers, set the stage for thousands of years of interaction between people and place. You wonder how much of that deep past still echoes, however faintly, in the fields and hills around us today.
Indeed. It's a legacy written onto the land itself.